Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 121 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Adam Carter for this episode, and we talked all about social media. I heard him give a presentation for the National Alliance for Children's Grief about social media specifically related to grief and teenagers and children. And I thought it would be such an interesting topic for us as parents to hear about as well. We talked a lot about how social media can be a very helpful tool and how important it is to talk with our kids and don't make assumptions. And Adam has quite a few helpful tips, I think, for those of us who are parents. Before we jump into that discussion, I wanted to let you guys know some news from here. First of all, next week on the show, I'm very excited. There will be a pair of episodes dropping back-to-back on August 9th and 10th, 2022. So first, on August 9th, will be Megan Reardon-Jarvis, who is the host of the Grief is My Side Hustle podcast, interviewed me on her show, and she is going to drop that next Tuesday, August 9th. And then immediately after that, she and I got to talk again, and I interviewed her, and that will drop on next Wednesday, August 10th. And we had such a great discussion about trauma and grief, and it was kind of mind-blowing. So I will wait until next week to tell you guys more about that, but please do be on the lookout for that pair of episodes. First, me on Megan's podcast, and then the next day, Megan on my podcast, next week, August 9th and 10th. And I also wanted to let you guys know that Future Widow, my book, is available at public libraries, and you can request the print book or the ebook from your local public library, and there's also a large print edition. So shout out this week to the King County Library System and the Seattle Public Library. So if you are in the Seattle area, it may be convenient for you to go to the Seattle Public Library or the King County Public Library to check out a copy of Future Widow. So thank you to those library systems for adding my book into their collection. Next week I'll tell you guys about some other libraries that have it. There are quite a few in the United States and a couple in other countries as well, so stay tuned for that. All right, that's all the news from here, so let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Adam Carter. Adam is the National Clinical Director at the National Alliance for Children's Grief. He is a counselor himself and an educator of counselors, and he has a PhD in counselor education and supervision with an emphasis in multicultural counseling. He's joining us today from Bloomington, Illinois. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jenny. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I've really been looking forward to speaking with you today. And so you're at the NACG, the National Alliance for Children's Grief, of which I'm a member. And I had such a great discussion with Vicki J., who is she the CEO or the executive director?
CEO, yes.
CEO. I know she's the one in charge. Right. And it was Children's Grief Awareness Month back in 2019 that I had her on the show. So we might have to get her back at some point.
You will. Children's grief has changed over the past several years, since 2019. And so I think having her back on to have those conversations would be helpful.
Oh, that's a good point, right? Because of of course, what's happened since 2019? The pandemic.
Right.
And the last numbers I saw, maybe you've seen more recent numbers than I have, 200,000 kids, I think, in the U.S. have lost a parent or a primary caregiver to the pandemic. And that was back in maybe February. So I don't know if there have been any updated studies or numbers since then.
Right. Those numbers do change because even those numbers, the ones that you're referencing, are based on models. We don't have it would be nice if we could count and say 1, 2, but we because sometimes deaths are not classified as COVID deaths, there may be complications as a result of. All of those numbers are estimations and models, and which makes it kind of hard for us too, as a children's bereavement field, to say, how many children have been impacted,
right,
specifically by the death of a loved one due to COVID. So.
Yeah, and then of course we have to add and to make sure we're not forgetting, we have other, people during these same 2 years that have died of cancer and car accidents and every other cause. And we have all the kids who lost people prior to the pandemic of whatever cause, and they all are still impacted in some way or another by grief potentially.
Yes, you're exactly right. To share a very brief personal, I'm not a child anymore, but
Mhm.
to say, both of my grandmothers have passed since COVID, so since 2020, and one did die as a result of COVID, and the other passed for other circumstances. But the other day we were on a work call and we were talking, and I made a comment. Well, I don't think my grandmothers could do that. And then I remembered that my grandmothers were dead. And it
Ah,
was one of those situations where, because of COVID, I wasn't able to go to funerals. We didn't have funerals, and we haven't had family gatherings. So I haven't seen spaces where my grandmothers aren't there. And so it's
oh,
sometimes hard for me to remember.
right.
I used to talk to one of my grandmothers on the phone. She and I had the same birthday, so we kind of had a kindred connection. And I talked to her on the phone quite often, but not talking to her on the phone is not quite the same as going through the mourning process and the process of seeing our family kind of come together. So, children, the same situation. There's been complications over not being able to experience the end of life traditions that they may experience. To be able to, we say sometimes people say start the grieving process. I don't think it's to start. I think it's to it starts well before that, but it is part of the process that kind of helps sometimes to solidify things. And unfortunately, children missed out on that for a while. In addition to all the things you shared, which was deaths before that we weren't able to provide services for during the pandemic because we weren't meeting together.
Right, right. And as we know, with children's grief, I mean, it could pop up at different developmental stages. It's not just like, okay, well, the person died 5 years ago, so they should be over it by now, and they don't need services. They might not need services. They might need services. They might be reaching a new developmental understanding and have some new grief all over again about what some people might consider an older loss.
Mhm. You're exactly right. What happens, for example, if a child graduated high
Mm,
school during the pandemic and
mm,
wasn't able to have a formal graduation here in Bloomington? The first year it was a drive-through. They were in cars and they drove through. And so, if you had a child, for example, who maybe lost a parent at a very young age, it could resurface and maybe even be complicated by the fact that my parent is not here at graduation and I don't have a graduation that looks like everyone else's. So
right.
you're exactly right. The loss doesn't have to have happened during the pandemic timeframe, but definitely can be complicated by it.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Lots to consider and lots of need for work in this space. So thank you to all of you guys at NACG for the work you guys are doing. I think it's really, really important. And today we're here to talk about social media.
Yes.
So you did a webinar recently for the
Mhm.
NACG. And just as an aside, I'll say to listeners that the NACG has terrific webinars every month, sometimes several every month,
Mhm.
lots of different topics. Some of them are geared towards professionals working in the field, but some of them are actually very appropriate and interesting to I would say to my listeners, to parents who are trying to better understand children's grief. So anyway, you gave a webinar on social media, exploring the role of social media in child and adolescent grief. I think its title was something along those lines.
Yes, you got it.
And I thought, wow. And your webinar was geared more towards people working at grief centers and thinking about that. But I thought this would be a really good topic for my listeners too,
Hmm.
because as parents with teens and tweens and maybe younger kids, most of our kids are on social media. Many of them are.
Yes.
Um, Lots of different platforms. We may be on social media more or less ourselves, may have a greater or lesser understanding of the different platforms and the different um, positive and negative aspects of all that. So I thought it'd be good to pull you in here and talk about this. So thank you. Let's just dive right in.
Hmm.
Um, I think there are benefits and challenges to this. Maybe we could start with what are a few of the benefits you think for social media use for kids or teens who are grieving?
Sure. We can tie it back into what we were sharing before in terms of maybe some of the things as related to the pandemic where the social nature of grief or even grief support has not been readily available over the past several years, like peer-to-peer support groups or even support groups in schools, because we don't want to put bodies in rooms together because it increases the risk of maybe catching COVID. So one of the benefits is that online or social media can help create a sense of community for children and adolescents who've experienced the death. So there are ways for individuals to share their information or share their stories related to their grief, where other children or adolescents are able to comment and talk about their shared experience. Because I think some of the most powerful things in groups is this realization that I'm not alone, because grief has this isolating component to where it sometimes feels like I'm the only one who's ever experienced it or experienced it like this. And when you add that into childhood and adolescence, which is by nature already kind of a difficult process of growing up, that feeling alone is sometimes magnified. So when we do groups, it's sometimes just magical what happens when you have a group of individuals sitting around, teenagers, for example, who start talking and realizing. You kind of sometimes see shoulders drop when they realize, okay, I'm not the only one. Well, when we haven't been able to do that recently, the way that our teenagers, and like you said, even younger children, are able to connect online and build communities themselves where they're getting some of that validation in a digital way, and are able to see that support and hear, okay, I'm not the only one who's experiencing it like this. It doesn't necessarily take the pain away, but it takes away this isolation feeling. That's a big benefit to the online social media aspect.
So yeah, definitely. And this is interesting because I see that a lot in the widow space. So now I'm talking about adults themselves, right? Maybe my listeners themselves. There are some really active Facebook groups for widows, and they're, various different, some of them have certain focuses, but, lots of widow Facebook groups where I see lots of people getting that support you're talking about.
Yes.
And connecting, and whether it's late at night or whether it's, because they're somewhere and there aren't any other widowed people in their neighborhood, but now all of a sudden they've got this community online.
Yes, that's exactly right. And with children, especially younger folks, and I still have 3 teenagers. One just turned 18 and she's getting ready to go to college. And so I still have to remember she is still my teen. But, they don't necessarily engage in the same type of materials. That they'll make fun of me for having Facebook because that's for old people. That's still the way that I communicate. So right. What we see a lot with them is that their interactions are a lot more fleeting, meaning where we may join a group that we get sustained support from. Children sometimes kind of look a little bit like butterflies that are landing on flowers and then moving away from the flowers. So that's the same support that I think we as adults sometimes kind of crave or look for is not necessarily the same things we would see with children and adolescents. They may come and get their validation and then step away from it because that space doesn't sustain groups like maybe some of the social media spaces we interact in.
So that's an interesting point, right? Because Facebook, which I also hear that, that's for old people, right? But a Facebook group could be, in a lot of ways, very similar to an in-person group in building those sustained relationships. And I see people over time getting to know each other and, each other's stories and supporting each other. So that's a good point. So if we're talking fleeting interactions, what are we talking about, like TikTok or Instagram, or where are teens going for these fleeting grief support interactions?
Oh, you hit the nail on the head. You're looking at things like TikTok. I have people who send me things that because they know I work in the field of grief, and so they'll send me TikToks that are grief related or individuals who speak on grief, and it is very interesting because it's an opportunity to create. Well, it has some ownership and some creation power over your grief experience because you're able to edit it. You're able to create it. You can put filters. You can do whatever you need to do to help with your story. And it could be time limited. So you have a minute. And so you're sharing your information with the world in a minute. And instead of having to maybe prolonged, oh my goodness, I have to go to group for 8 weeks for an hour, someone can create this, share this information, and it's there. The other pieces are connecting on social media platforms like Snapchat, things, and Instagram. pieces like that, where again, that information can be, you can create a connection and then connect with each other, and it's on your terms. Meaning, if you want to engage with this person, you can. If you want to block them and move on, you can do that as well. But it also gives children and adolescents an opportunity to receive that support without necessarily having to engage in it. So it almost looks a little bit, I don't know, like kind of like a grief warrior, where you're sitting on the side, seeing the things that you may be experiencing without being forced to engage if you're not ready. So I don't have to talk myself, but I can see that others are engaging in it.
Yeah. Okay. I was wondering about that because a minute ago you were talking about creating your own post and it might be limited to 30 seconds or a minute. I'm guessing that there's also, I know TikTok has a lot of hashtags and some of them are grief related hashtags. So I'm guessing that a kid or a teenager might be following some of those hashtags and consuming then the content that's coming across their feed that's been hashtagged as, I don't know what, teen grief or something, my dad died, or hashtag something related.
Exactly right. And in those ways, it's another control piece, because another aspect of grief, and this is me not sharing anything new, is this loss of control. Grief has this loss of control that goes along with it. And so being able to decide what information you're consuming is a way to have control over that as well. To, like you said, hashtag my dad died. Or if it's maybe a publicly disenfranchised grief, such as if a loved one died by suicide or overdose or homicide, where that information, if you were to share it in person in public, the person may have a horrified look on their face, so you don't share it anymore, right? I don't share my story because I don't want to feel like I have to comfort the person I share the story with.
Yeah.
If you look for that hashtag and you look for those pieces, then you can consume that information. You can see it on your terms. And Jenny, if I don't like it, I can just hit skip, right? I don't have to watch the full 30 minutes. I can scroll on and decide whether or not I like it.
Right. Okay. So with all of this, I'm guessing there may be some, I don't know if you want to call them pitfalls or downsides or watch out for this or that, or some kind of things that parents might want to be aware of. Can you share some thoughts on that?
Sure. My first one is anyone can post anything online, right? And so that's the piece, is that there's no real way to determine that the information that someone's posting is accurate or true to their information or true to their story. And so it's very important as we as caregivers are supporting children and adolescents, that we're helping, not necessarily helping make that decision for them, but engaging in conversations to help them learn how to make those decisions, to learn how to say, oh, okay, well, just because I read it online does not instantly mean that it's true, or that this is what's occurring, or this is what's happening. There was a post I used in the webinar where someone had posted that, hey, can you all go onto my page and respond, rest in peace, because my girlfriend, I don't want to talk to her anymore and I want her to think that I died. And so there was this example, right? And so this person did not die, but they wanted this social media experience so that the ex-girlfriend thought that they had. So it's helping them discern that not all the information that they see online is actually true, which goes with everything. But with grief, again, we're looking for connection, and we have maybe this very soft spot. And so when we see something that we connect with, especially children and adolescents, they may cling to it really quickly and hard, only to find out it's not true, which then again complicates that grief, or can complicate rather.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And I suppose also could end up, as you mentioned, this, the skill of evaluating what's true and not on social media is I guess it's a life skill at this point, right? And it could apply to lots of different topics that might be, I was just researching today, like shoulder injuries, right? Online. And of course, there's a lot of good information. There's probably bad information too. And so that skill of deciphering, right, applies here as well as in lots of other things. Okay. One of the things I was thinking about, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on this. When you mentioned about public grief, and you think you were on a different point than what made it triggered me thinking about, there was a YouTuber who died about 2 weeks ago. Technoblade. Did you hear about this?
I did not.
Yeah, he was a young man, like 22, 23 years old, and he had a very aggressive cancer. And I think he hadn't told his followers quite how serious it was. He had shared that he had the cancer and he was getting treatment, and then all of a sudden he died. And it triggered, I think, a lot of teen grief. He was a massively popular YouTuber. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I mentioned this, and I've read, like when Kobe Bryant died, for example, and this question of like, well, if you didn't know him, how can you grieve? But it's a public figure, and the fact that does trigger grief in a lot of people.
That's right. We even have a term for it. It's called parasocial relationships. And parasocial relationships are where individuals create relationships with, say, public figures, or let's use the YouTube figure, for example, where they feel or believe that they have a relationship with this person because they do consume their content, whereas the person on the other end may not, and usually does not know that other person exists. And so the relationship really is kind of one-sided, but it serves a purpose, right? And we all, Mr. Rogers does not know I existed, but I was sad when he died.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yes,
right?
Right. And so these parasocial relationships oftentimes are the things that are criticized very heavily online. So when someone posts, like you said, rest in peace, Kobe Bryant, and people are like, well, why do you care? Like what you're a lot of times those things are, you're just seeking attention. Grief as an attention seeking behavior. Whereas this individual has this parasocial relationship with Kobe Bryant, or with like Chadwick Boseman, for example, very similar, had a very aggressive cancer, didn't share that information. And his loss is still felt very widely because of these parasocial relationships and the person that he was. And that's another one of those pitfalls of something that I call grief policing, which is saying me as someone outside of your grief gets to decide whether or not your grief is valid or not.
Right.
Because if you didn't know them, you shouldn't be grieving them. Whereas we know that's not true because of the nature of parasocial relationships.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for explaining that. And on the Technoblade example, I just want to mention, highlight for parents. He was a Minecraft YouTuber. Mm-hmm. So if you guys are listening and have tweens who or teens who are super into Minecraft YouTube, you might kind of be have on your radar screen that maybe they knew Technoblade, or maybe they watched him every day, right? And the other thing that's interesting, I heard from a listener who said that her daughter was super upset when Technoblade died because one reason was he had an aggressive cancer, and her dad had an aggressive cancer. Mm-hmm. And that just triggered her, she was sad about Technoblade, and it triggered her grief about her dad all over again too.
Right. Yes.
Even though the loss, by the way, had been 5-6 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And in these parasocial relationships too, like Technoblade, for example, if Technoblade had not shared with their followers that they had that aggressive form of cancer, then it also it could present like a loved one who chose not to tell a family member that I'm sick, right? I hear this a lot with like college age folks, where a loved one, especially a parent, let's say a parent is dying of a disease, but they don't want to tell the person who's in college because they don't want it to impact the person who's in college. Well, the person comes home and they see that this loved one is extremely sick. And then there's this anger that's there in the college student, because it's I wish you would have told me, because I could have come home and had maybe been with mom before she got to a place where she could not walk or talk. And the same thing can be triggered here with this is, if I do not know that you're sick and I do not know that you're potentially dying, and then all of a sudden you die, I didn't get a chance to kind of prepare myself for what's occurring, and very similar processes.
Right. And you might have made different choices with your time,
exactly,
right? When you declined that lunch because you were busy and you could do lunch next month just as well.
That's exactly right.
Right. If you knew I was dying, you probably would have made time for the lunch.
Yep.
And by the way, this is a hypothetical example. I'm not sick, but
no, but you're exactly right. And if I knew that Technoblade was dying, maybe I would have written, or I could have DM'd Technoblade to let them know how much they meant to me.
Right.
Because I take for granted that their content is out all the time, and that's what I watch, and I consume massive amounts of it. But if I knew that he was sick, I could have, and like you said, fill in the blank, whatever that child or adolescent feels like they could have done.
Right. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, this is a really good discussion. I'm glad that that this came up. I'm thinking about another one of the potential uses or benefits of social media you had mentioned in your presentation was about this concept of memorialization. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
You sure can. So there are some companies that have kind of designed websites or memorializations that families or systems can go online, and you can look at it, and as a system you can create a web page or a virtual memorial for your person who died. And I have noticed over the past several years, I say several years, so it's probably been 10 or 15, that even funeral homes are starting to create or allow to have this type of piece where there's a memorialization page where you can go and, light virtual candles or share virtual flowers or things that, if you're not able to make it to a memorial in person, there's a way for you to still contribute and be a part of it. So there are companies that do that, and there's also ways that families can do that have a no cost associated with it, such as Google Sites, which is a website. Google has web pages that you can pick templates from, and as a family you can post pictures, and you can create online forums where people can talk about the person who died. But it's a way that the family can have this online space to interact with their person who died's memory. Now, of course, there's some things to be prepared on that, and the things that I encourage is making sure before you kind of enter into an agreement with an agency, if you're going to say pay for that, is who owns the content. So if you decide that you want to go with a certain company because they have really good templates, and maybe you're not tech savvy and you just want to drag and drop pictures, making sure that you still own your content and that the company then doesn't own the pictures that you put on there, because we never want to see a picture of our person who died in an advertisement for that company that we didn't consent to,
Right.
but we actually did consent when we hit that button that says, I agree to the terms and conditions.
When there's like 10 million little tiny words and you just click
right.
agree, right?
That's exactly right. And so making sure that you know who owns the content that's on there, but also who's going to keep the page going. So that's important, because let's say we have a child who is, let's just say 5 or 6, and as a system, you create this page. Well, the child comes back and says, I remember that we had this page for grandma when they were 10 or 15, and they go back to the page and it's not there anymore. And that actually could be another loss. It's this is the way I'm interacting. Or let's say they check every day, and then the caregiver in the system decided that, well, I don't want to pay for it anymore, or I don't want to maintain it anymore. I don't think anyone's looking at it. And so they take it down. It could potentially be another loss to the child. And so that's a big question before you even enter into it is, well, how are we going to keep this up? Who's going to keep this up? How long? Do we want to maybe set a limit? Do we want to say we're going to create this virtual memorial space for a year, and we will start it now, and then we'll maybe on the death anniversary we'll come together and we'll close it as a family. That way there's a sense of closure even around that memorialization.
Interesting. Well, and it's a good reminder to parents too. Like you mentioned, the parent might be thinking, oh, probably nobody's looking at this anymore, and just shut it down. And it's a good reminder that even if kids are somewhat young, to not just make assumptions and take actions like that, but to, loop them in somehow, whatever that looks like for the situation in the family. This has also reminded me that I think that the funeral home that handled my husband's funeral had some kind of online something or other, which I never really, I think people could probably leave remembrances, right? And we had a Caring Bridge site where that I had been updating people. And so most people were posting there. But I think there were probably some remembrances on the funeral home site, and I should probably go and print those out and put them somewhere as a future, thing to hold on to, because who knows what I didn't create that with them. They created it. So I don't know what might happen to it.
Right. And that's exactly right. That's a kind of like when we talk about pro cons. Pro is that it opens it up for individuals to be able to kind of engage or participate with us as we are kind of in that memorialization process. The con is, again, what happens and how do I get those? And, especially if we're looking at, let's say, older generations who may not know how to download those comments, are funeral homes collecting those comments and sending them to them in a written form or something that can be had? And if not, are there ways that we can help our relatives downloading that information to make sure they have it?
Right. So since we're talking about this topic of memorialization, that reminds me that I think Facebook has something they call memorializing people's profiles. Can you share with us a little bit about Facebook profiles when people died and what the options are and what we should maybe be thinking about?
Sure. So there's a couple. The process is very similar for Facebook and Instagram because Meta owns both of them.
Right.
But there's this memorialization option, and on Facebook, you do have to in settings. You can go into settings, and it's very easy to Google Facebook memorialization page, and it gives you the step by steps. But in just what it is, it's for example, with me, my husband is my person that if I were to die, he has access to my Facebook page where he can go in and let Facebook know that I have died, and the Facebook page then changes to a memorialization page. And so he then gets to decide how that information is shared, because what it does is it creates this online space where people can still go back through my pictures and look at my posts and engage with me in a virtual and digital way, which nowadays is almost stream of consciousness, right? And so if you go back through my Facebook page, you can be like, yes, Adam loves Mr. Rogers and taco recipes. And that's what I loved about him. And I want to go back and I want to look at those things. And I want to look at those pieces and I want to engage with him. And so there's a way to engage in that memorialization, but it does require that you assign someone who can let that agency know or who can assume responsibility for your social media profiles, maybe upon your death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. And I'll find a link to the Facebook memorialization stuff and link to it in the show notes. And I do think that because I haven't memorialized my husband's profile yet, and it's been 6+ years, and I probably should. But at the time, it was one of those things where I was like, all the other paperwork and all the other nonsense to deal with. I was like, I don't know, this can wait. And I wasn't sure what memorialization, if I'd be losing something, right? If I'd regret doing that. But I do think they have a way I think that legacy contact thing you're talking about, if he had set me up as a legacy contact, which might not have even existed back then, I don't know. But because I think when Sheryl Sandberg's husband died, they then did a bunch of grief-related changes and procedures and like things that they implemented on their platform. But I think there is a way anyway that as a close family member, I could contact them with a death certificate or something and have it memorialized.
Very much so. It is a process, and like you said, it's another thing sometimes to have to take care of amongst the list of things that happens when someone dies. Right. But it's there and it's possible, and I can't necessarily speak to the fact that it reduces, say, hacking, for example. But if your person who dies all of a sudden starts to post again, for example, if someone has hacked a site, that could be extremely upsetting, bordering on traumatizing, to see this person who you loved in her mourning to then see posting, hey, I made $10,000 yesterday and let me show you how. Right. And so
buy some cryptocurrency.
That's exactly right. But so it's having that space that you can go and engage with their virtual places. It can be very, very healing and helpful.
Yeah. And to be clear, it's not deleting them, removing them, making as if they never existed. It's a yeah. Well, and the other thing, speaking of things that might be upsetting, I noticed Facebook sent me a very helpful message a few days ago saying, you have an anniversary with Dennis Lisk coming up in 5 days. Don't you want to get a present? And I'm like, all right, this is probably why I should just do the memorialization thing so they don't tell me stupid things like that.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully, right? Hopefully, if the page does go memorialization, they understand to do those pieces. But yeah, you're exactly right.
The other thing that I've done is which I was just mentioning to somebody the other day, I suppress, you know how they give you picture memories on this day in 2000 and whatever. And usually it pops up a cute picture of my kids when they were 3. And I'm like, yay. Right. But for a while I was getting the memories of 2015. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to suppress everything between May of 2015 and January of 2016. Like, if I want to see those pictures, I'll go look for them, but I don't need Facebook to remind me on this day 6 years ago you were at the hospital.
That's right. Yep. And same thing with things like Time Hop, for example, that pulls from your social media. It pulls from your photos. It pulls from Facebook. It pulls from Instagram. It pulls from Google Drives, and it pulls those pictures with those dates, and it kind of puts them in one little place for you. And scrolling through them, you're exactly right. Where you have you're going to come across pictures, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be a death related loss, but you're like, ooh. I didn't need to remember that this is the day that I filed for divorce. I didn't need to remember that.
Right.
And they do. The only time I've ever seen there be a warning, it's on Valentine's Day. They have a warning before you start scrolling that says, hey, there's Valentine's Day pictures in here. If you're not with a person anymore, you may want to skip today and not necessarily go through the Valentine's Day pictures. That's the only time I've ever seen that. And in my mind, I'm thinking, sometimes we have to create that own kind of warning in our mind to say, oh, yeah, we're getting close to the time that my person died.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. And so we talked about Facebook and Instagram, and I suppose that listeners might also want to think about, do some did my person have a LinkedIn account? Did they have a YouTube channel? Did they have a Pinterest account? And maybe go and just make a list of things to look into and check off. And I suppose most of them probably have some memorialization type options as well.
Sure. Right. Because with LinkedIn, for example, if that page is not deleted, you're getting emails that say, hey, this person has a 25th anniversary with the company, and they maybe have died 5 or 6 years ago. But LinkedIn is still just counting those times and sharing information as if the person was still with us.
All right. Well, I've put more things on my to-do list after this discussion. So thanks, Adam.
Of course.
Oh, boy. All right. Well, let's see. What have we missed on the topic of, I think we've had a really good wide-ranging discussion here. Have we missed some challenges that you wanted to mention or some benefits that you wanted to mention?
You've got the good ones, the memorialization, the connection piece. There are some things on Instagram, like there's an Instagram called Grief Kid. It's all one word, that has these kind of very rudimentary cartoons that we as maybe caregivers can follow if we wanted, and then share with children, or have children. This Grief Kid is very young. It's from a woman who she's 30 now and lost her mom at age 14. And that there's this connection she has to her 14-year-old self. And what did my 14-year-old self need to hear or see or understand? And this kind of love that she has for her 14-year-old self that she's healing still through those losses. So there are some really good Instagrams and pieces for those connections, which we covered. The challenges we had talked about, and the other pieces, this is an unfortunate part of our reality, but if a child or adolescent posts something online, being prepared for just flat out mean comments. Is that it's not necessarily going to be an overwhelming sense of support, especially if it's done in public forums where the child or adolescent has not cultivated a friends list that they feel comfortable with. Let's say it's a public post and someone posts about their person who died. There could be very mean comments. I shared, I'm married to a man, for example, and so if I were to die, and there's a public post and they go back and there may be very mean comments about the fact that I was married to a man that my children don't need to see, right? So the comment is not about the death itself, but about things that people don't like. So I think it's very important for us to have conversations with our children and adolescents about those things, that that posting it can be healthy, but the response may not be. And so how do we handle and process those responses as a family, I think is important to discuss.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. And since you mentioned Instagram and resources, I was also thinking of a couple of my prior guests. There's a site called This Is Why, and I'll put the link in the show notes. But it's a young man, he's 20 something, who's collecting stories from people who lost a parent at a young age and sharing them, people writing essays and things about their experiences. And similarly, there's something called teenagegriefsucks.com. Mm-hmm. And the woman or the teenager who put that together is a high school student, and sharing stories, from other young people. And so I think if it's reminding me that those kind of fit in the social media,
right?
Let's get support in some untraditional online way from people who are sharing their stories.
Yeah.
And feeling less alone that way too.
And I think it's important for us to have a conversation because the word you just used, you said untraditional. They're not untraditional for our children. They're untraditional for us, and I think we're gonna see that more and more and more. That we are a generation where the internet was invented, right?
Right.
Like, we remember when the internet did not exist, or I remember when the internet was on one computer in the library. And so for us, it is unconventional, but for our children and adolescents, this virtual form of connection is starting to become a traditional. It is the way that folks grieve collectively, and so just being aware of that will be helpful, that we may be experiencing something as adults that our children are experiencing in a different way. But it doesn't mean that they're quote unquote not grieving, right? It doesn't mean that that's occurring. It just may be done in a different way that has become normal for a younger generation.
Right. Okay, good. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's an important point. Okay, well, I do think we're reaching the end of our time. This has been such a good discussion. I hope that listeners have learned a lot about social media and grief and their kids and their teens, and will open the door to some discussions with their kids and their teens on this. But I wanted to ask you as we wrap up, if you have a final thought, if you could say, one thing to parents about this topic, what would you leave them with?
I would say with parents is that having conversations with your children and teen about social media, specifically around kind of information about their grief and death related posts, is extremely important. It could be a difficult conversation to talk about, but having conversations that say, I'm not trying to tell you what you can and cannot post. Let's just talk about what information you are sharing and what happens when that information is not received in a way that you had hoped, because we don't want our children to be hurt online or in social media ways by individuals who are commenting or saying just flat out mean things when our children are being vulnerable and sharing and trying to seek connection. So have those conversations, talk about what that looks like, and create spaces that if that does occur, that your child's able to come to you and say, I put it out there and it didn't go well, and I need to talk with you about it.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. Well, I think that's a great place to end. So my guest today is Adam Carter, who's with the National Alliance for Children's Grief. So Adam, where can listeners find the NACG if they would like to access all your terrific resources?
Sure. Well, the NACG has just launched a brand new website, which is nacg.org. The website is designed to actually be family friendly. And so looking for resources, our resources are front and center, as well as at nacg.org, able to find any sort of bereavement support in your area as well. So a lot of great resources there that designed for caregivers, but also opportunities to connect with bereavement support if that's something you're looking for.
Terrific. Okay, well, I'll put a link for sure in the show notes to that and encourage listeners to go and check out all the great resources at the National Alliance for Children's Grief. And Adam, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jenny. I really appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Adam Carter as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 121. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening. And until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.